Hey, what's up again, guys? Mr. Castro, let's take a look at the fourth chapter of the American pageant. See what some of the stuff in terms of the life of people in the 17th century. So one of the things that we've talked a little bit about, right, it was what things were like in the Chesapeake. In the Chesapeake, right, life was harsh. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, typhoid. Few of the people lived past the age of 50, right? Women were scarce, 6-to-1 ratio. And again, we had talked a little bit, those of you that were there at the summer writing stuff, right, that the majority of the women that were there, they were there simply to help sort of procreate. Virginia was the most populous one with 59,000 people. Again, it will become the most populated of the colonies. So Chesapeake, right, again, excellent for tobacco growth. They exported 1.5 million pounds of tobacco in the year 1630. But what's really incredible, right, is if you look 70 years later, right, they were exporting 40 million pounds of tobacco. So it will, again, right, it will be the number one source of income in terms of some of the southern colonies, right, and really for the colonies in general until it's going to be surpassed by, cotton, right? So cotton will eventually surpass it. So more supply meant cheaper product. However, that also meant that you needed more people, right, to work. It also meant that you are going to need more land because they're going to overexhaust the land. Initially, one of the things we had looked at, right, was the head right system. So the head right system becomes really important, right? This idea that you would get 50 acres of land for every indentured servant that you would bring over. So one of the things to think about, right, are push and pull factors for people wanting to come over. Indentured servants, again, they lasted for about 7 years. They eventually became, this is super important, right? They became the first American frontiersmen because as soon as it was over, their indentured servitude, right, they were going to push west. And so they were the ones that began to push west. And one of the things that we'll see is that that's only going to be successful for the first indentured servants, right? So at the turn of when the 17th century becomes the 18th century, right? So at that turn, it's going to be a lot more difficult for people to be able to find land. So again, you can see here, right, just the head right system arriving. So one of the things that changes everything, right, is that by the late 1660s, right, again, a lot of the free, poor, landless single men were frustrated. Again, they're pushing the frontier. So in 1676, because they were pushing the frontier, right, the Indians, the natives are going to get really upset, right? You're pushing into their area. So what happened was some of the frontiersmen, they asked the governor of Virginia, Governor William Berkeley, right, to do something about it. And he said no. And the reason he said no is because he was actually relying on that trade with the frontier native people, right? So in 1676, a former indentured servant by the name of Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion against Virginia Governor William Berkeley. Before the revolt really had much of an implication on anything that was happening, um, Nathaniel Bacon will actually die, and the rebellion dies with him. However, it is super important because what it does is it means that the poor white indentured servants, right, they are not going to just stand by and idly and watch this happen. So Bacon's rebellion is super important because A, it leads to the end of being able to control the indentured servants. So that means that they're going to have to look elsewhere, right? They, meaning the owners, are going to have to look elsewhere. And so one of the things that they'll do is they'll begin looking at black slavery. Between 1492 and 1700, anywhere from 10 to 15 million people were brought to the Americas across the Middle Passage. Again, we'll never know the exact number. Roughly 400,000 had come to the U.S. One of the things I was telling you, right, is that they are beginning to think that maybe a lot of them came from the area of like Ghana. So Bacon's Rebellion, again, changed everything. The majority of slaves came from West Africa, again, places like Senegal and Angola. The Barbados slave codes, one of the things that we see, right, is that in the Caribbean, these slave codes were born of racial superiority, and they were eventually brought to the colonies, the English colonies, when the Carolinas were founded during the Restoration period. So slaves were considered essentially like property right, and they had no rights. So you can see here, right, I love this map because you can actually get a pretty good, clear picture of just how many islands there are in the Caribbean. And so you could see, right, just where Barbados was. This is actually the island over here, San Salvador, right, the one that Columbus actually landed in, or on. So American slavery, you can see where, right, so the denser the color, right, that's where you tended to have more slaves. So you can see, right, that the slaves, one of the things that becomes really important, right, is just some of these states, right, when we eventually get to the Civil War, or I should say colonies, right, eventually becoming states, South Carolina, right, will be the one who in 1860, right, they will be the first ones to actually break off. Sorry, there's supposed to be a picture. So again, one of the things that's really important, right, is I kept telling you guys, right, so as a result of these plantations, one of the things that we see, right, is a social pyramid emerge. The first families of Virginia were these first aristocrats. We're eventually going to start calling them slaveocracy, right, because they are the aristocracy. And so one of the things that we'll see, right, is that they were the ones that dominated the House of Burgesses, right? Some of you in your essay said that the South didn't believe in education, or it wasn't as strong. It was, right, but obviously only with the wealthy. One of the things too, right, is that because they had fewer cities, there was a lack of schools, like churches, right? So the Southern society tended to be very loyal to England, right? And so most of them were Anglican when it came to religion. New England finally, right, the climate led to healthier living, cleaner water, cool temperature, less disease. The life expectancy was 7 years, right? Again, they came as family units. Typical woman was expected to have about 10 children. Southern women had more power, okay? Because when the male died, the woman, if she was still alive, she got to everything transferred over to her. Many laws existed in New England regarding social behavior, right? And that's a very Puritan thing. One of the things that we will look at, right, is like the A for adulterers. Again, you can see the New England. So, life in the New England town, right? Very organized. Towns were legally chartered by colonial authorities. Meeting house surrounded by house and village green, right? So, again, you'd have the meeting house, which was essentially the church, and then you have everything around it, right? Economically and socially, it made sense. Towns of more than 50 families had to provide primary school education. That's huge, right? Towns of more than 100 had to provide secondary education. And then eventually that's going to spring up just higher places of learning, right? Harvard College in 1636 to train young men to become ministers, right? The first university in the colonies. The second one comes later, about 60 years later, right? William and Mary in Virginia. It's actually where Thomas Jefferson went to school. The Puritan meeting house, right, and the form of democracy led to political democracy in New England because, again, as time went by, more and more people and certain events, right, like eventually led to like the rechartering of New England by William and Mary, right? That's going to lead to more and more people participating in government. Again, a picture of what colonial Boston probably looked like. Harvard. This is the old meeting house, South Meeting House in Boston, and everything kind of developed around it. You can see today Borders and 7-Eleven. So one of the things that did happen, right, in the North is because religion did play a big role, but as time went by and the towns got bigger, a place like Boston, for example, right, as these towns got bigger, not only did time create a gap between those who, like, if you think about it today, right, maybe the children aren't as religious as the parents, right? There's something missing there culturally. So one of the things that ends up happening in New England, right, is the same thing is going to happen, where you're going to have, as time passes, fewer and fewer people sort of having that connection to the church. Another thing that's going to happen as a result of this too, right, is because, not as a result, but I should say a reason why this begins to happen is because as the towns were growing literally farther out from the church, right, people were less connected to the church. So an experiment was done, something called the halfway covenant. This is super important because as church membership began to decline, they tried to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to get more people to come to the church, right? So the Puritans experimented with two forms of recruitment. First, they tried to do what was called the Jeremites, which preachers scolded parishioners for like the waning piety, right? Like just not showing up, or like, oh, you're going to go to hell. The second was more of a progressive sort of thing, right? They introduced the halfway covenant. So full membership in the tax-supported congregational church required conversion. So in order to be a part of the church and the decision-making, only then could children be baptized. All people could come and participate in the church, and children would be allowed baptism. So one of the things that's going to happen, right, is that they were basically going to allow like a halfway membership to certain people, and their children would be able to become baptized. And so eventually their children would become members, right? So parents decided to go to church and support the church, right, with taxes, because there was a chance that their children could actually participate. So picture here, right, the halfway covenant, which kind of was a precursor to the great. So the hysteria, one of the things we'll talk about in class, right, is what happens when you try to mix, when you try to mix God's laws with essentially man's laws, right? And so we'll have a conversation about this. And this is what ends up happening, right? In Salem, in 1692, as a group of Salem girls claimed to have been bewitched by certain older women. The witch hunt led to the execution of 20 people. 19 of them were hung, and one was actually pressed. The hysteria ended in 1683, right? And again, it raises this issue of secularism, which we'll talk about in class. So New England, right? Soil in New England made it difficult for growing. That doesn't mean that they didn't farm. New Englanders became great traders, less ethnically mixed than the middle colonies. They diversified agriculture and industry. Slavery was attempted, but became unnecessary, right? Rivers were short and rapid. They ran into the Indian view of the land. And again, they prospered with things like fishing, right? So there was the quote in New England, God and cod, right? So in the next chapter, what we'll look at is we'll take a look at some of the things that were happening prior to the American Revolution.